It had been over 30 years since I last wore anything close to that uniform, the one I had once donned with a kind of silent pride, not because it carried medals or rank on its shoulders, but because it represented a service that almost no one knew existed. The summer of 1978 in San Diego came with its usual dry warmth, the kind that clung to your collar and made the salt in the air taste like memory. I had been invited, officially, though anonymously, to attend a commemorative ceremony on the deck of a Navy vessel moored in the harbor. It was meant to honor veterans of Cold War operations, and though I didn't know who had added my name to the list, I decided to show up, not to make a statement, but to feel again, if only for a few moments, the echo of something I had once lived and long since buried. As I walked toward the gangway, dressed in a plain blue blazer and a pressed white shirt that still held the scent of cedar from the closet I rarely opened, I could feel something tightening in my chest. It wasn't anxiety exactly, nor nostalgia. It was more like a quiet tension between what had been and what had never been acknowledged. On the left side of my chest, discreetly tucked beneath the edge of my lapel, was the emblem I had guarded for decades. A stylized sonar wave beneath a minimalist trident, the insignia of the Underwater Surveillance Division, a unit that officially did not exist, composed of men and women who listened to the ocean floor, recorded patterns, identified enemy submarines, and reported findings that would never see the light of a public record. That symbol wasn't printed in any Navy register, nor recognized at ceremonies. It was something you earned in silence and carried in silence. I had barely reached the top of the gangway when two junior officers stepped forward, stopping me with the firm but respectful professionalism I remembered all too well. One of them glanced at the emblem on my jacket and said, with a hint of discomfort, "Sir, I'm afraid that insignia isn't authorized for this event. We're only allowing official decorations and recognized unit symbols." I nodded quietly. I didn't argue. I had learned long ago that some battles are not worth fighting, and that silence, once chosen, was not something you abandon easily, even in the face of injustice. But just as I was about to turn away, a voice rose behind them, calm, low, commanding. An admiral stepped into view, white uniform pressed, silver hair cut close, his eyes scanning my face, then dropping to the insignia on my chest. He paused, and in that pause, I saw something change in him. A flicker of memory, recognition, maybe even guilt. Then, without ceremony, he said, "You served under silence. Come aboard, shipmate." And just like that, the years fell away, not erased, but finally seen. If this story touches something in you, as it did in me when I lived it, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps keep stories like this alive. Stories that never made the papers, but shaped lives all the same. And now, prepare yourself, because what comes next will change everything. I served between 1955 and 1962 as a sonar surveillance technician with the United States Navy, stationed in a classified coastal facility just outside Monterey, California. Though stationed is probably too clinical a word for what we were. Not soldiers in the traditional sense, not intelligence officers with the clearance to walk through Langley's front doors, but rather ghosts of a sort, existing in a liminal space between science, security, and silence, where every shift was spent not in combat zones or with rifles in hand, but in soundproof rooms, staring at waveform patterns, trying to tell the difference between ocean currents and Soviet submarines hundreds of feet below the surface. The Cold War, for many Americans, happened on television screens and newspaper headlines, missile tests, presidential speeches, protests and parades. But for us, it happened in silence, in the deep, in frequencies and signatures most people could neither hear nor understand. My job was to listen. 10 to 12 hours a day, headphones clamped over my ears, eyes locked on sonar screens that flickered with the pulses of the unseen world. We weren't allowed to speak of what we did, not to family, not even to other servicemen on base. Our operations were buried under layers of classification. Even the base itself didn't carry our unit's name. We were simply Technical Group 14, which could have meant anything to anyone, and that was the point. We trained under civilian scientists from the Naval Research Laboratory, many of whom had once worked on wartime submarine detection systems. But our protocols and assignments came directly from naval intelligence. Everything was compartmentalized. We didn't ask who was listening on the other end of the recordings we sent. We didn't ask where the vessels were routed. We didn't even ask what happened when we intercepted something we weren't supposed to find. That wasn't our job. Our job was to detect, to log, and to remain silent. I remember one particular night, winter of '58. The Pacific was restless, a storm pressing hard against the coastline, and inside our bunker, the lights flickered as the wind howled through vents. I was on a double shift, tired, eyes sore, when I caught a signal, faint but rhythmic, an acoustic signature that didn't belong to any friendly vessel. I ran diagnostics, scrubbed interference, isolated the sound. What I was hearing matched the known signature of a Soviet Whiskey-class sub, but in a place no Soviet vessel should have been. I logged the data, filed the report, sent it up the chain. 2 days later, that entire section of our archive was redacted. My access was restricted. When I asked what had happened, my supervisor simply said, "It's not your concern anymore." I never heard about that incident again. That was how it worked. You gave them your ears, your time, your loyalty, and in return, you got nothing but silence. No medals, no recognition. Just the quiet understanding that you were doing something important, something real, even if no one would ever know about it. The emblem I carried, that trident and sonar wave, wasn't official. It was given to us unofficially by one of the engineers, printed on brass and passed out to those of us who'd served multiple tours without question, without error. It was a private symbol, a token of a brotherhood no one else could see. I kept mine hidden in the inside pocket of my sea bag for decades. I never wore it publicly, not until that day on the deck. During those years, I saw friends transferred overnight without explanation. I saw marriages fall apart under the weight of secrecy. I wrote letters I couldn't send. I kept logs I couldn't show. And every time I tried to explain to someone, even years later, on what we did, I was met with blank stares, with polite nods, with discomfort. Because there's something alienating about having lived through a reality that the rest of the world denies ever existed. But I knew it was real. I lived it. I felt the hum of those machines under my feet. I listened to the distant conversations of whales and warships. I heard sounds no civilian would believe. And through it all, I held on to one thing more than anything else, a promise I made to the woman I loved, Margaret, that no matter how long I had to stay silent, no matter how far the orders pulled me away, I would return to her. That promise, as strange as it may seem, anchored me more than any regulation, more than any command. It was personal, but it made the mission personal. It gave the silence meaning. Years later, I would wonder if those years changed me too much, if the silence had carved a hole in my voice that would never be filled again. But on that deck in San Diego, as the admiral looked at the emblem, that small, unofficial symbol that no one else recognized, and gave me permission to come aboard, I realized something I had never dared believe, that even silence can be honored, that even ghosts can be called by name. I don't remember the exact day I first saw her, not because it wasn't important, but because from the moment Margaret appeared in my life, she seemed to exist outside of time, as if she had always been there in some unspoken way, just waiting to emerge from the haze of uniform schedules and dim-lit corridors that defined my world back then. She wasn't part of the Navy in any official capacity, not listed among ranks or duties, but had been brought in through a civilian medical exchange program, part of the Navy's outreach to supplement its base hospitals with trained nurses from public health programs along the West Coast. She arrived with calm eyes, a quiet voice, and a strength that revealed itself not through authority, but through her unwavering presence. There was something about the way she moved through the ward, precise, gentle, never hurried, that contrasted starkly with the cold mechanical routines of our classified station. In a place dominated by sonar equipment, ticking clocks, and the ever-present hum of power generators, Margaret carried a stillness that unsettled me in the best possible way. Her hands smelled faintly of lavender soap, a small rebellion against the sterile smell of antiseptic that clung to every surface. And her smile, though reserved, carried a warmth I had nearly forgotten people could still offer to one another in a place built entirely around caution, procedure, and secrecy. We began with looks, then nods, then short conversations in the break room, which always ended with one of us glancing at the door, checking who might have overheard. Our connection grew in the spaces between protocol, brief moments, barely minutes, where we let ourselves speak like people, not personnel. She never asked what exactly I did, and I never volunteered it, but she knew enough, and I think I loved her for never pressing further, for letting the silence be part of the intimacy, not an obstacle to it. Eventually, I began leaving small notes, folded scraps of paper tucked behind the gauze in the supply closet, handwritten phrases like, "You look tired today, rest when you can," or "Don't let the walls take away your softness." And she replied, sometimes with flowers slipped into my locker, sometimes with a cookie and a napkin, once with a drawing of a seagull, and the words, "Not all of us belong to the sky, but we can still dream of it." I started writing her full letters, encoded, of course, simple substitution ciphers we devised together as a game. But deep down, we both knew why we used them. Because love, even in its purest form, could be dangerous in a place where every file was reviewed and every deviation noted. Before my final deployment in 1961, I handed her one last letter, sealed, marked with a phrase only she would understand. "If I disappear, read this twice." It wasn't melodramatic, it was precautionary. Because in our world, people disappeared not with gunfire or battles, but with paperwork and reassignments. One day they were on your roster, the next their name had been scrubbed, their room reassigned, and you were expected to forget they ever existed. The mission I was assigned to would take me north, a covert deployment in the North Pacific, listening posts, tracking activity near the Aleutian Trench. No return date, no outside communication. I was gone for almost 5 months, and when I came back, the ward where Margaret had worked was empty. The nurses had changed. Her name wasn't on any schedule. When I asked, I was told she had been transferred. Due to improper association with classified personnel, they said. No one would elaborate. A warning look from my supervisor told me to let the matter drop. But I couldn't. I checked every base record I could access. Nothing. I asked a petty officer who had once dated a nurse from Margaret's cohort. He looked down and said, "She got flagged. Somebody reported something." And in that moment I understood that what we had, small, quiet, innocent in the face of so much else, had been noticed, catalogued, and punished. Not because we broke any law, but because we allowed ourselves to feel something in a place designed to make people forget what feeling even was. I never saw her again, never heard from her, and I couldn't reach out. Even if I had known where she'd been sent, any attempt to contact her would have triggered alarms, reviews, interviews. Our history was not ours anymore. It had been absorbed by the system, stored in some anonymous report, its real meaning reduced to a line item under breach of conduct. But I kept her letters, those written in code, those little tokens we had traded. I never showed them to anyone, never even opened some of them again. I wasn't ready, because reading them meant acknowledging what was taken and admitting that the Navy, the country, the Cold War, all of it had decided for us that our story didn't deserve to be told. Yet even in silence, I never stopped carrying her. And sometimes, in the low hum of an old fridge late at night, or in the sound of the sea lapping at the docks on a foggy morning, I could almost hear her voice again, not as a memory, but as a promise still echoing between the walls we once shared. For more than a decade after I left the service, I rarely spoke of my time in the Underwater Surveillance Division. Not because I had something to hide, but because over time it became painfully clear that no one wanted to listen, and that even if they did, they wouldn't understand what it meant to give years of your life to something that didn't officially exist, to wear a uniform without a N. Imtag, to serve without ceremony, to love without witness, and to return without welcome. The emblem, that small brass pin with the trident and sonar wave, remained sealed inside a box that I kept buried in the back of a filing cabinet, tucked between outdated operator manuals, naval charts marked confidential, and yellowed photographs that had long since lost their color but not their weight. I didn't pull it out often. Sometimes, on sleepless nights, I would open the drawer, lift the lid, and hold the pin in my hand, its cold surface pressing into my palm like a question I didn't yet know how to answer. There was no citation attached to it, no file number, no name. And yet, it was real, more real in many ways than the rows of official medals I'd seen handed out to officers whose service, while honorable, had taken place entirely in the light. I was never invited to reunions. My name never appeared in newsletters. The VA didn't list me as part of any specific operation. When I tried once, just once, to explain what we had done to a younger Navy recruiter at a job fair, he blinked and said, "I'm sorry, sir. I don't think that was a real unit." I walked away without a word. How do you prove you existed when the country you served worked so hard to forget it ever asked anything of you? By the mid-1970s, something began to shift. America was looking inward. Vietnam had ended. The Watergate hearings had torn open a nation's illusion of control, and suddenly stories that had once been too strange, too quiet, or too classified to be believed were beginning to surface. I read an article in a small veterans journal about a former Navy radio operator who had served at a listening station off the Atlantic coast, whose records had been sealed, whose work had never been acknowledged. It was like looking into a mirror, and for the first time in years, I felt the urge to write. I started slowly, a few lines in the margins of a journal I kept by my bed, then more. I began transcribing sonar shifts from memory, sketching out patrol logs, recreating conversations, both real and imagined, that I had never dared to speak aloud. I wrote about Margaret, about the day she vanished from the base, about the list of names we had once recited under breath in the debriefing room, about the sound, the pings, the hums, the silent alerts that only we could hear. Writing gave form to a life that had become vapor. It was, in some small way, a way of saying, we were here. Then, one afternoon in late spring, I saw a flyer pinned to the bulletin board of the local American Legion Hall, San Diego Fleet Week, commemorative event for veterans of naval surveillance, intelligence, and silent service units. At first, I thought it was a mistake. I hadn't seen those words printed together, silent service, in any public context. But there it was, typed plainly, and beneath it, the date, the location, and the line that made my hands tremble. All Cold War veterans welcome, regardless of operational classification. I dug the emblem out of its box, polished it, pressed my suit. I didn't expect anyone to know my name. I didn't expect applause. I only wanted to stand among them, even if they didn't see me. Just once I wanted to step back aboard a deck I had walked in silence and not be invisible. When I arrived, the ceremony was already underway. There were speeches, music, men in pressed uniforms and women in dress whites. Flags waved, people saluted. And then came the procession of veterans. A long line of us, shuffling forward to the main deck. I pinned the emblem to my lapel. It was the first time I'd ever worn it in public. As I reached the top of the gangway, a young officer stopped me. He wasn't unkind. He looked down at the pin and said, "Sir, I'm sorry, that's not an authorized insignia for this event. Are you sure you're in the right place?" I hesitated. My hand moved to the emblem. I thought for a moment of turning away, but before I could speak, a voice rose from behind, calm, clear, authoritative. "That symbol," the voice said, "belongs to a man who served where most of us never dared to." An admiral stepped into view. He looked older than I remembered, but then again so was I. He walked toward me, nodded and added, "Let him through. This man's earned his place on this deck." And for the first time in my life, I stepped forward, not as a shadow, not as a ghost, but as someone finally, irrevocably seen. After the ceremony had ended and the crowd began to disperse, families gathering for photographs, officers trading salutes, veterans shaking hands with a kind of quiet reverence, I lingered near the edge of the deck, not out of hesitation, but because I needed a moment alone to breathe it in, to let the past settle into the present without collapsing under the weight of everything I had spent decades trying not to feel. The breeze had shifted slightly, carrying the smell of brine and diesel, and as the sun dipped behind the Pacific, I watched its light stretch over the steel hulls like something holy. The admiral, the same one who had spoken for me earlier, approached without ceremony. He didn't offer congratulations or questions. He simply said, "Would you come with me?" and gestured toward the old officer's wardroom, a space I hadn't seen in decades, but which immediately brought back memories of classified debriefings, coffee poured into white ceramic mugs, and long silences punctuated by nods between men who could never put their truth into words. Inside, the room smelled of wood polish and old paper. Maps lined the walls, their edges curled with time. Ship models gathered dust on a high shelf, and at the far end of a narrow desk lay a sealed envelope, yellowed by age, corners softened, ink fading just slightly, but still legible. The admiral stood beside it, his hands behind his back, as if the weight of what he was about to say required a kind of posture not taught in any manual. He looked at me and said very simply, "This came into my hands many years ago. I wasn't sure who it was meant for, until today." I stepped forward slowly, heart beating in a way I hadn't felt since I was a young man on deployment, staring down at encrypted transmissions, wondering if they meant danger, hope, or nothing at all. When I picked up the envelope, I knew instantly, by the tilt of the handwriting, the way she looped her L's, that it was from Margaret. I didn't have to open it to know. Her presence was woven into every fiber of the paper, but I opened it anyway. Inside, the words were few, carefully written, not poetic, not desperate, just true. "You came back," she had written. "But silence took you away again." I sat down, the envelope still open in my hand, and stared at the sentence as if it were a map, as if by studying it closely enough I might find a way back to her, to the version of myself that had once believed love could survive anything, even the machinery of secrecy and the architecture of war. I wanted to ask the admiral how he had come to have it, but the truth was, it didn't matter. What mattered was that she had written it, that she had received my letter, that she had waited, at least for a while, that she had known I had come back, and that, in some quiet, devastating way, she had understood why I hadn't come to find her. Because silence hadn't been a choice. It had been my duty, my burden, my protection. For her as much as for myself, there is a grief that comes from loss, but there is a different kind of grief, quieter, heavier, that comes from knowing you were loved in return and couldn't do anything about it. That was the weight I carried out of that room. I asked the admiral no more questions. He offered no further explanations. We stood in silence, a better kind of silence this time, until I nodded, thanked him, and left the wardroom with the envelope tucked safely into my breast pocket, the emblem still pinned to my lapel. That night, I didn't go home right away. I walked the Embarcadero for hours, letting the harbor lights blur into stars, letting my thoughts drift with the sound of the tide brushing against the dock pilings. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I simply walked, with her letter in my chest and the Pacific at my side, knowing that while time had stolen our chance, it had, in the end, returned our story to me. And in that, there was peace. These days, I walk the waterfront in San Diego like a man without a flag. Not because I'm lost, but because the country I served, the people I loved, the years I gave, all exist in a space that can't be found on maps or in monuments. I walk in silence, not out of habit, but out of respect, for the sounds I once listened to with such intensity, for the voices I could never answer, and for the echoes that still return to me, even now, after all this time. I don't wear a uniform anymore. I don't attend reunions or ceremonies. But every morning, when I pass the Navy pier and watch the ships cut across the water, I feel something stir in me. Not pride, not nostalgia, but something deeper. A kind of quiet knowing that I lived a life most people will never understand, and that within that silence, I carried truth, pain, service, and love. In my home, a modest apartment a few blocks from the harbor, I keep two things on a shelf above my desk. One is the emblem, the sonar wave and the trident, polished now, no longer hidden in a drawer, but set in a simple wooden frame. The other is the envelope, Margaret's letter. The one she wrote in a time when she believed I might still return, not just in body, but in spirit. The one that told me, in a single sentence, that she had waited, that she had known, and that she had forgiven. Sometimes I wonder what my life might have looked like had I chosen differently, had I walked away from duty, had I chased her across the country, had I spoken when I was ordered to stay silent. But those thoughts fade quickly, not because they don't matter, but because the man I was couldn't have done otherwise. He had taken an oath. He had been entrusted with silence, and though that silence cost him more than anyone will ever know, he kept it. For his country, yes, but also for her. The Cold War took my youth, my chance at a family, and the right to tell my story. But in return, it gave me something I didn't understand until much later. A legacy not written in medals or promotions, but in the quiet endurance of someone who chose to serve without applause, of someone who loved even when love had no place to land, of someone who was forgotten and still found a way to be remembered. That day on the Navy deck, when the admiral stepped forward and recognized the symbol, he didn't just see a man, he saw a life. He saw the thousands of hours logged in silence. He saw the letters never sent, the names never called, the loss never acknowledged. And in that moment when he said, "Come aboard, shipmate," I was given something I never dared to ask for. Not thanks, not vindication, but a return to myself. And that's why I tell this story now. Not for recognition, not for pity, but because I believe there are others still out there who served in shadows, who loved in silence, who lost without ever being told why. And to them I say, you were not invisible, you were not alone, your story mattered. Even if no one else ever saw it, I did, and I see you now. We share new stories every day, true stories that move, that inspire, and sometimes, like this one, that finally set the record straight.